What would you do if you discovered your trusted farm helper had buried 3 elderly women in their own fields? Would you confront him? Would you run? Would you call the police? Well, when I found his kill list with my name at the top, I chose the one option he never expected from a 75-year-old farmer's widow. My name is Betty Caldwell, and I'm 78 years old now. Most folks in Millfield County know me as the stubborn old woman who still runs her own farm despite what everyone calls common sense. They see me driving my ancient pickup truck to the feed store and think they know my story. Just another elderly widow too proud to admit she can't handle the work anymore. What they don't know is that 3 years ago, I came face to face with pure evil disguised as helpfulness. And what I did to that evil is something I've never told another living soul until now. The drought of 2020 nearly broke me. At 75, I was trying to maintain 160 acres of corn and soybeans with equipment that was older than most people's grandchildren, and a body that protested every morning when I got out of bed. My husband Frank had been gone for 8 years by then, and our son Michael had moved to California, convinced that his inheritance would be better served if I sold the farm and moved into assisted living. But this land had been in Frank's family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had cleared these fields with nothing but an axe and a determination that I'd inherited along with the deed. I wasn't about to be the first Caldwell to give up, no matter how much my arthritis complained or how often the banker called to discuss my overdue payments. That's when Jake Morrison answered my ad in the County Herald. Experienced farmhand seeking work. Reliable, hard-working, excellent references. Willing to work for room and board. Plus modest wages. The ad was everything I needed to hear, and when he showed up at my door on a sweltering July morning, he looked like the answer to my prayers. Jake was maybe 35, tall and lean with the kind of weathered hands that told you he'd done honest work his whole life. His clothes were clean but worn, his truck was old but well-maintained, and he had this way of looking you straight in the eye when he talked that made you trust him immediately. When I showed him around the property, he asked intelligent questions about crop rotation and soil composition, nodding thoughtfully at my answers like he respected my knowledge despite my age. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, as we stood in the barn, looking at Frank's old John Deere tractor, "I can see you've been working this land with love and care. A place like this deserves someone who understands what it means to a family." The way he said it, with such genuine understanding in his voice, made something tight in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Here was someone who got it, who understood that this farm wasn't just a business or a piece of property. It was legacy, history, home. I hired him on the spot and showed him to the small apartment above the equipment shed that Frank had built for seasonal help back in better days. Jake settled in like he'd been there his whole life, organizing the tools with military precision and making a list of repairs that needed attention. For the first month, Jake Morrison was everything I could have asked for in a farmhand. He was up before dawn, working until sunset, and never complained about the heat or the back-breaking labor of keeping an old farm running. He fixed the irrigation system that had been limping along for 3 seasons, rebuilt the engine on the combine that everyone said was beyond repair, and somehow coaxed a decent yield out of fields that hadn't seen proper fertilizer in 2 years. But more than his skill with machinery, Jake had this way of making me feel useful again instead of just a burden who was too stubborn to know when to quit. He'd ask my advice about planting schedules and listen to my stories about how Frank used to manage the farm during drought years. He made me feel like a partner instead of an employer, like my experience mattered as much as his strong back. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch after supper, and Jake would tell me stories about his travels, the different farms he'd worked, the places he'd seen. He talked about growing up in foster care, bouncing from family to family, never really having a place to call home. The loneliness in his voice when he spoke about his childhood made me want to mother him, to give him the stability and belonging he'd apparently never had. "I've been thinking," I told him one evening as we watched the sunset paint the cornfields gold, "maybe you should consider staying on permanently. This place needs someone young and strong, and you've got a real understanding of farming." The smile that crossed his face was so genuinely pleased, so grateful, that I felt proud of myself for the first time in months. "Mrs. Caldwell, that would mean more to me than you could ever know. I've been looking for a place to belong my whole life." It was around the end of the 2nd month that I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Jake would get phone calls that he'd take privately, walking out to the far end of the property where I couldn't hear the conversations. Sometimes I'd catch him studying the legal papers on my desk when he thought I wasn't looking. Not like he was snooping exactly, but like he was trying to understand something specific about the property ownership. He started asking casual questions about my family, about whether I had children who visited regularly, about my health, and whether I took any medications. When I mentioned that my doctor had prescribed blood pressure pills, Jake seemed particularly interested in the details. What kind? How many? Whether they made me dizzy or confused. I told myself these were just the natural curiosities of someone who was thinking about staying long-term. Someone who wanted to understand his employer's situation. But there was something in the way he asked. Something just a little too focused, that made me uncomfortable even though I couldn't put my finger on why. The first real warning sign came when Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm stopped by with a casserole and seeing Jake in town talking to the county clerk about property records. Seemed real interested in land ownership laws, she said, glancing toward the barn where Jake was working. Asked a lot of questions about what happens when elderly folks die without wills. Things like that. I tried to brush off her concern, explaining that Jake was just being thorough and understanding the farm's legal situation. But that night, lying in bed listening to the summer cicadas, I found myself thinking about how quickly he'd settled in, how perfectly he'd answered my ad, how convenient it was that such an ideal farmhand had appeared exactly when I needed him most. The second warning came from my banker, Mr. Henderson, who called to discuss my loan payments and casually mentioned that someone had been asking questions about my financial situation. Fellow seemed to know quite a bit about your property already, Mr. Henderson said. Claimed he was thinking about making an offer if you ever decided to sell. When I asked Jake about it that evening, his explanation was smooth and reasonable. He said he'd been curious about land values in the area, thinking maybe he could eventually buy a small place of his own nearby. I hope you don't mind, Mrs. Caldwell. I just wanted to understand what I might be able to afford someday. But something in his eyes when he said it made my instincts prickle with unease. It wasn't guilt exactly. More like satisfaction, like a man who was pleased with how well his plans were progressing. That's when I decided to do some investigating of my own. And what I discovered in the county records office would change everything I thought I knew about the helpful young man I'd welcomed into my home. But what I found there was nothing compared to what I would discover hidden in his truck. The Millfield County Courthouse keeps records going back over 100 years. And if you know how to look, those dusty files can tell you stories that would curl your hair. I'd spent enough time there helping Frank with property disputes and tax issues to know my way around the filing system. So when I decided to research Jake Morrison's background, I knew exactly where to start. What I found was disturbing enough to keep me awake for 3 straight nights. According to the public records, Jake Morrison had indeed worked for several farms in the area over the past 5 years. But what caught my attention was the pattern of what happened after he left each job. Mrs. Eleanor Vaughn, age 73, had hired Jake as a farmhand in 2018. 6 months later, she was found dead in her farmhouse, apparently having suffered a heart attack while alone. Her property was sold at auction to pay debts that no one knew she'd accumulated. Jake Morrison had been the one to discover her body and call the authorities. Mrs. Dorothy Martinez, age 69, had employed Jake in 2019. She died in what appeared to be a farming accident, crushed beneath her own tractor when the jack slipped while she was changing the oil. Again, Jake had been the one to find her body. Again, the property went to auction to satisfy mysterious debts. Mrs. Ruth Kellerman, age 71, had been Jake's most recent employer before coming to work for me. She'd supposedly died of complications from pneumonia in early 2020. But what made my blood run cold was the description of her final weeks. According to the obituary, she'd been confused and disoriented, prone to accidents and memory lapses. Her doctor had suggested she might be developing dementia. 3 elderly women, all living alone on valuable farmland, all had hired the same helpful young man. All had died within 6 months of his employment. All had their property sold to pay debts that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The pattern was too clear to ignore, too coincidental to dismiss. But the most terrifying part was realizing that I fit the profile perfectly. Elderly widow, living alone, owning valuable property, no family close by to ask uncomfortable questions. I drove home from the courthouse with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Seeing Jake's kindness and helpfulness in an entirely different light. The way he'd asked about my health, my medications, my family situation, the interest he'd shown in the property records and legal documents, his questions about whether I had a will or life insurance. That evening, I forced myself to act normal, to maintain the routine we'd established over the past 2 months. I cooked dinner and called Jake in from the fields, chatting about the weather and the corn prices, while studying his face for signs of the monster I now suspected him to be. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said as we ate, "I've been thinking about that back 40 that's been giving you trouble. Might be time to consider selling it separately if the right buyer came along. Sometimes it's better to let go of what you can't handle than to risk losing everything." The suggestion was presented as helpful advice, but I heard it differently now. He was already planning how to break up my land, how to make it easier to liquidize after my convenient death. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing crop rotation instead of dismantling my life's work, made my stomach turn. "I appreciate the thought," I replied carefully, "but Frank always said Caldwells don't give up land without a fight." Something flickered in Jake's eyes at my response. Irritation. Maybe. Or impatience. For just a moment, the helpful mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. But he recovered quickly, smiling that warm smile that had fooled me for 2 months. "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell. I just worry about you taking on more than you should at your age. But you know your situation better than anyone." After dinner, Jake said he was going into town for supplies and wouldn't be back until late. As soon as his taillights disappeared down the county road, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for his apartment above the equipment shed. If he was planning what I suspected he was planning, there would be evidence somewhere. The apartment was neat as a pin, almost sterile in its organization, but hidden in the bottom drawer of an old dresser, wrapped in a towel, I found what I was looking for. A manila folder containing newspaper clippings about elderly deaths, property records from multiple counties, and most damning of all, a handwritten notebook that detailed his methods. The notebook was like a how-to manual for preying on elderly farmers. It contained profiles of potential targets, analysis of their financial situations, and step-by-step plans for gaining their trust. Each entry was clinical, methodical, like a scientist documenting experiments on lab rats. But what made my hands shake as I read was the entry about me. Betty Caldwell, 75, widow, 60 acres prime farmland, estimated value $800,000. No close family, limited social contacts, some financial stress. Health appears good, but takes blood pressure medication. Trusting nature, lonely, grateful for help. Timeline 4-6 months. Method: accident with farm equipment or medication overdose disguised as heart attack. Property should sell quickly to cover manufactured debts. I was reading my own death sentence, written in the neat handwriting of the man I'd welcomed into my home. The man I'd started thinking of almost like a son. But the notebook contained more than just plans. It contained photographs, pictures of his previous victims in their final weeks, documenting their decline, their confusion, their gradual loss of independence. I saw Mrs. Vaughn looking frail and disoriented, Mrs. Martinez appearing dazed and unsteady on her feet, Mrs. Kellerman in what was clearly the final stages of systematic poisoning, and at the back of the notebook, several blank pages labeled with my name and the current date, space reserved for documenting my own decline and death. Whenever Jake decided the timing was right, I'd put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and made it back to my house just minutes before Jake's truck pulled into the driveway. When he knocked on my door to let me know he was back, I managed to smile and thank him for picking up groceries in town, all while my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. That night, I lay in bed, listening to every sound, wondering if tonight was the night he decided to accelerate his timeline. Every creak of the old house made me jump. Every rustle of wind through the corn made me wonder if it was footsteps approaching my bedroom window. But Jake wasn't ready to move yet. The next morning, he was back to his helpful self, working in the fields and making conversation over breakfast as if nothing had changed. But I could see him differently now, could recognize the calculated way he observed my reactions to things, how he was constantly measuring and evaluating my behavior. Over the following days, I started noticing other things I'd missed before. How he always insisted on bringing me water when I was working in the heat. Water that had a slightly off taste I'd attributed to our old well. How he'd offer to pick up my prescriptions from the pharmacy in town, claiming it saved me a trip, how he'd sometimes serve my plate at dinner before serving his own, always being so considerate about giving me the larger portions. I realized he'd probably been drugging me in small doses for weeks, nothing dramatic enough to cause immediate illness, but enough to make me gradually more confused and dependent on his help. The occasional dizziness I'd been experiencing, the memory lapses I'd blamed on age, the increasing fatigue that made me rely more heavily on his assistance. It had all been orchestrated. But Jake Morrison had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that a 75-year-old farm widow would be just as helpless and trusting as his previous victims. What he didn't know was that Betty Caldwell had been fighting one battle or another her entire life, and she'd learned a few things about survival that weren't in any textbook. The question now was what to do with what I'd discovered. Going to the police seemed like the obvious choice, but I knew how that would sound. Elderly woman making wild accusations against the helpful young man who'd been keeping her farm running. Jake had been careful to establish himself as my concerned caretaker in the community. Who would believe that such a model citizen was actually a serial killer? I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, and I needed to stop him before he could disappear and find another victim, another elderly farmer who would welcome his help with grateful trust. That's when I realized that Jake Morrison had taught me exactly what I needed to know to defeat him. All those stories he'd told about his methods, all the evidence he'd carefully documented. He'd basically given me a roadmap for turning his own tactics against him. But first I had to survive long enough to put my plan into action, and that meant continuing to play the role of the trusting elderly woman, while secretly preparing for the fight of my life. The real battle was about to begin. The hardest part about fighting a predator is that you have to let him think he's winning while you're actually preparing his defeat. For the next 2 weeks I played the part of the declining elderly woman that Jake expected to see, all while secretly building the case that would destroy him. I started by being more careful about what I ate and drank, finding excuses to dump out the water Jake brought me or to feed my dinner to my old farm dog when Jake wasn't looking. I could feel my head clearing as whatever he'd been giving me worked its way out of my system. But I had to hide this improvement, had to continue acting confused and dependent while actually becoming sharper and more focused each day. The first step was gathering evidence that would convince the authorities. I managed to collect samples of the food and water Jake had been bringing me, storing them in labeled containers that I hid in my root cellar. I photographed pages from his notebook with a disposable camera, being careful to replace everything exactly as I'd found it. But most importantly, I started documenting Jake's behavior, keeping a detailed journal of his questions, his suggestions, his gradual escalation of control over my daily routine. I recorded the times he went through my mail, the phone calls he made late at night, the way he'd steer conversations toward my health and my plans for the property. I also began reaching out to people who'd known Jake's previous employers, being careful to frame my questions as casual curiosity rather than serious investigation. Mrs. Patterson had been friends with Eleanor Vaughn, and over coffee one afternoon, she shared details about Eleanor's final weeks that painted a disturbing picture. Poor Eleanor just wasn't herself those last few months, Mrs. Patterson told me, stirring sugar into her coffee with trembling hands. Started having dizzy spells, getting confused about simple things. That young man of hers was so patient with her, always helping her with tasks she'd done her whole life. But it seemed like the more he helped, the worse she got. The pattern was becoming clearer. Jake would gradually increase his victims' dependence on him, while simultaneously making them appear less competent to handle their own affairs. By the time they died, everyone in the community would see it as a natural progression of age and illness, rather than the systematic destruction of their independence. But I needed more than just circumstantial evidence and suspicious patterns. I needed to catch Jake in the act, document his methods in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That meant I had to let him think his plan was working while actually setting him up for exposure. The opportunity came when Jake suggested I should update my will to reflect my changing circumstances. He'd been dropping hints about estate planning for weeks, always presented as concern for my well-being, always framed as practical advice from someone who cared about my future. Mrs. Caldwell, he said one evening as we sat on the porch, I've been thinking about what would happen to this place if something happened to you. With your son so far away and no other family close by, it might be smart to have a clear plan in place. I played along, expressing confusion about legal matters and gratitude for his concern. I suppose you're right, Jake. Frank always handled those things, and I'm not sure I understand all the paperwork involved. I could help you with that, he offered, his voice warm with false sincerity. I've learned quite a bit about property law working for other folks over the years. We could draft something simple, just to make sure your wishes are clear. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Jake was moving to the next phase of his plan. The part where he'd manipulate me into leaving him the property or at least giving him legal authority to handle my affairs. It was the same pattern he'd followed with his previous victims, and it would give me the evidence I needed to prove his murderous intention. That's so thoughtful of you, I said, letting my voice quaver with elderly uncertainty. I don't know what I'd do without someone looking out for me like this. Over the following week, Jake helped me draft what he presented as a simple will and power of attorney documents. But I was recording every conversation, capturing his subtle manipulation as he guided me toward decisions that would benefit him. He was careful not to be too obvious about it, always framing his suggestions as being in my best interests, but the direction was clear. The documents he prepared would give him control over my medical care, my finances, and my property if I became incapacitated. They also included provisions that would allow him to make decisions about my care without consulting my son in California, effectively cutting off my only family connection. Just practical precautions, Jake assured me, as we reviewed the papers. This way, if you ever get confused or have health problems, there won't be any delays in getting you the help you need. But I could see through his concern now, could recognize the predatory calculation behind his helpful facade. He was systematically isolating me from any external support, while positioning himself to inherit everything I owned. While Jake thought he was manipulating me into signing my own death warrant, I was actually gathering evidence of his predatory pattern. Every conversation was recorded. Every document was photographed. Every suggestion was documented with dates and details that would show the systematic nature of his exploitation. But I also knew that evidence alone might not be enough to stop him. Jake had successfully murdered 3 elderly women without ever being seriously investigated. His methods were too subtle, too carefully designed to look like natural death or accident. Even with all the evidence I was gathering, I might not be able to convince authorities to act quickly enough to save my life. That's when I realized I needed a different kind of approach. Instead of just trying to prove Jake was a killer, I needed to make him prove it himself. To force him into a situation where his true nature would be undeniably exposed. I started subtly changing my behavior, becoming slightly less compliant, asking more questions about his suggestions, showing signs of independence that would threaten his control. Nothing dramatic enough to make him suspicious, just enough to suggest that his careful conditioning might not be working as well as he had planned. The effect was immediate. I could see Jake's frustration when I questioned his advice about the will, could sense his irritation when I mentioned calling my son to discuss the property arrangements. He'd invested months in grooming me as his next victim, and any sign that I might slip out of his control clearly disturbed him. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said one evening, his voice carrying a slight edge I'd never heard before. "I hope you're not having second thoughts about the arrangements we discussed. Sometimes elderly folks can get confused about what's best for them." The way he said confused was almost a threat. A reminder that he had the power to make me appear mentally incompetent if I didn't cooperate with his plans. It was probably the same kind of subtle intimidation he'd used on his previous victims, a way of making them doubt their own judgment while reinforcing their dependence on his guidance. But I wasn't Eleanor or Dorothy or Ruth. I was Betty Caldwell, and I'd been dealing with men who underestimated me my entire life. Jake Morrison was about to learn that this particular elderly farmer's widow had a few tricks of her own. The trap I was setting would either save my life or end it. But either way, Jake Morrison's killing spree was about to come to an abrupt and very public conclusion. What happened next would shock everyone who thought they knew sweet old Betty Caldwell. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the corn was ready for harvest, and Jake had decided the timing was perfect for my convenient accident. I'd been expecting it for days, watching for signs that he was moving from the preparation phase to the execution phase of his plan. The signs were subtle, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Jake had been increasingly insistent about me taking the new vitamins he'd brought from town, claiming they would help with my energy levels. He'd also suggested several times that I should operate the old corn harvester myself, saying the exercise would be good for me and that he'd be right there to help if I needed assistance. What Jake didn't know was that I'd spent the past week preparing for this moment. Hidden throughout the farm were recording devices I'd purchased from a security company in the next county. Motion-activated cameras that would capture whatever happened. And most importantly, Sheriff Palmer was positioned less than half a mile away waiting for the signal I'd arranged. The morning started like any other, with Jake arriving at the kitchen door for coffee and discussing the day's work. But I could see the tension in his movements, the barely controlled excitement of a predator who was finally ready to claim his prize. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, stirring his coffee with deliberate casualness, "I think today would be perfect for you to try running the harvester. The weather's ideal, and I've got everything set up just right." I played the part of the uncertain elderly woman, expressing doubts about my ability to handle such complex machinery. "I don't know, Jake. It's been years since I operated anything that complicated. Maybe you should handle it yourself." "Nonsense," he replied, and I could hear the subtle pressure in his voice. "You can't depend on hired help forever. Besides, I'll be right there to guide you through it. What's the worst that could happen?" The way he said, "What's the worst that could happen?" sent chills down my spine, because I knew exactly what he thought was going to happen. A tragic accident, where an elderly woman lost control of dangerous farm equipment, with her devoted helper trying desperately but unsuccessfully to save her. We walked out to the field where the harvester waited, and Jake spent several minutes explaining the controls with what appeared to be patient instruction but was actually careful positioning. He showed me exactly where to stand, exactly how to engage the machinery, exactly which mistakes would look like natural errors from a confused elderly operator. "Now remember," he said, his hand resting on my shoulder, in what would look like protective guidance to observer. "When you hear the engine speed up, that's when you need to be extra careful about your footing. These old machines can be unpredictable." But what Jake didn't realize was that I'd been operating farm machinery since before he was born. I knew every sound, every vibration, every dangerous quirk of the equipment he was trying to use as a murder weapon. And I'd spent the past week making some modifications of my own to his carefully planned accident. As I climbed into the operator's seat, I could see Jake positioning himself exactly where he wanted to be, close enough to appear helpful, but far enough away to avoid any real danger when the accident occurred. He was calculating angles and timing, probably rehearsing in his mind how he would describe the tragic event to the authorities. That's when I decided it was time to stop playing the helpless victim and start being the farm woman who'd been surviving challenges her entire life. "Jake," I called out over the sound of the engine, "before I start this up, I want to ask you something. Did you really think I was stupid enough not to figure out what you've been doing?" The change in his expression was immediate and telling. The mask of helpful concern dropped away completely, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "Mrs. Caldwell, I think the stress is getting to you. Maybe you should come down from there and let me handle this." But I wasn't coming down, and I wasn't backing down. "I found your notebook, Jake. I know about Eleanor Vaughn and Dorothy Martinez and Ruth Kellerman. I know about the poison you've been putting in my food, the documents you've been trying to get me to sign, and the accident you're planning to have with this harvester." Jake's hand moved toward the emergency shutoff switch, but I'd already disabled it as part of my preparations. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely uncertain, his carefully planned script disrupted by a victim who wasn't following her assigned role. "You don't understand the situation you're in," he said, his voice taking on a menacing tone I'd never heard before. "You're a confused old woman making wild accusations. Who's going to believe you over me?" "The sheriff might be interested in what I have to say," I replied, pulling out the two-way radio I'd hidden in my jacket. "Sheriff Palmer, this is Betty Caldwell. We're ready for you now." The response crackled back immediately. "On our way, Mrs. Caldwell. Keep talking." I could see panic flicker across Jake's features as he realized that his carefully controlled situation was spiraling out of his hands. This wasn't supposed to happen. His victims were supposed to die quietly, conveniently, without ever understanding what was being done to them. "You stupid old bitch," he snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I've spent months setting this up perfectly. I know exactly what I've done," I replied, feeling stronger and more confident than I had in months. "I've stopped a killer, and I've made sure everyone will know exactly what kind of monster you really are." That's when Jake made his final, fatal mistake. Instead of trying to run or talk his way out of the situation, he let his rage override his caution. He lunged toward the harvester, probably intending to cause the very accident he'd been planning, but with me as a deliberate rather than unwitting victim. But I'd been expecting this moment, had been preparing for it since the day I found his notebook. As Jake rushed toward the machinery, I engaged a modification I'd made to the harvester's safety systems. A modification that would protect me while ensuring that anyone trying to sabotage the equipment would face serious consequences. The sound of Sheriff Palmer's sirens was already audible in the distance when Jake triggered the trap I'd set for him. What happened next was swift, decisive, and thoroughly documented by the cameras I'd positioned around the field. When the sheriff arrived with his deputies and the state investigators I'd requested, they found Jake Morrison in no condition to charm his way out of trouble. They also found all the evidence I'd gathered over the past weeks, including recordings of Jake's own admissions and detailed documentation of his methods. But the most damning evidence came from Jake's own notebook, which I presented to the investigators, along with samples of the substances he'd been using to poison me and copies of all the legal documents he'd been preparing to steal my property. As they arrested Jake Morrison and read him his rights, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since Frank's death. This predator would never hurt another elderly woman, never again use trust and vulnerability as weapons against the innocent. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come, when the full scope of his crimes would be revealed and justice would finally be served for Eleanor, Dorothy, Ruth, and all the other victims whose voices had been silenced forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when evil thinks it has buried it deep enough to never be found. The arrest of Jake Morrison sent shockwaves through Millfield County and beyond. What had started as a simple case of attempted fraud quickly escalated into one of the largest serial murder investigations the state had ever seen. Within days of his capture, law enforcement agencies from 3 states were coordinating their efforts to uncover the full scope of his crimes. The evidence I'd gathered proved to be just the beginning. Once investigators knew what to look for, they found connections between Jake and suspicious deaths, stretching back over a decade. The pattern was consistent: elderly farmers living alone, valuable property, mysterious deaths that appeared after their deaths, and always the same helpful young man who'd been the last to see them alive. Jake had been even more prolific than I'd realized. The 3 deaths I'd uncovered were just his most recent victims. In total, investigators linked him to 11 suspicious deaths across 4 states, with evidence suggesting there might be even more cases that hadn't yet been identified. The toxicology analysis of the food samples I'd saved proved that Jake had been using a sophisticated cocktail of substances to gradually poison his victims. Plant-based compounds that would break down in the body and be difficult to detect in routine autopsies, combined with prescription medications that would cause confusion and disorientation without triggering immediate medical concern. Mr. Morrison had developed what can only be described as a systematic approach to murder. District Attorney Sarah Chen explained to the packed courtroom during opening statements. He identified vulnerable elderly people with valuable assets, gained their trust through apparent kindness and helpfulness, then slowly poisoned them while positioning himself to inherit their property. The prosecution presented evidence showing how Jake had used multiple identities and fabricated references to gain employment with his victims. He'd studied estate law and elderly psychology, developing techniques that allowed him to manipulate vulnerable people while appearing to be their devoted caretaker. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was Jake's own documentation of his methods. The notebook I'd found contained detailed analysis of his victims' personalities, their weaknesses, their family situations, and the specific approaches he'd used to exploit each one. It read like a manual for preying on the elderly, written by someone who viewed human beings as nothing more than sources of income. Jake's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was a troubled man who'd been driven to desperate measures by childhood trauma and financial pressures. They painted him as someone who'd made terrible choices but who wasn't the calculated predator the prosecution described. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated nature of Jake's poisoning methods, explaining how he'd deliberately chosen compounds that would cause maximum suffering while avoiding detection. Financial analysts showed how he'd systematically stolen over $2 million from his victims, using their trust and confusion to transfer assets to accounts under his control. Most damaging of all was Jake's own testimony. When he took the stand in his defense, he couldn't resist trying to justify his actions, to explain how he'd actually been helping his victims by giving them purpose in their final months. These were lonely old people with more money than they knew what to do with, he said, his voice carrying the same false sincerity I'd heard for months. I gave them companionship, made them feel useful, helped them feel needed. The fact that they chose to show their gratitude through their wills was just natural human generosity. The prosecutor, Miss Chen, was ruthless in her cross-examination. Mr. Morrison, did Ms. Eleanor Vaughn choose to show her gratitude by dying of arsenic poisoning? I never poisoned anyone, Jake replied, but his composure was cracking. If these women got sick, it was from natural causes that coincidentally occurred only after you'd gained access to their food, their medications, and their legal documents. I was trying to help them die so you could inherit their property. That's when Jake finally snapped, revealing the callous predator he'd kept hidden beneath his helpful facade. You don't understand what it's like, he shouted. These old people, they're just waiting to die anyway. Their lives are meaningless, wasted. At least I gave them some purpose, made their death serve something greater. The courtroom erupted at this admission. Jake Morrison had just confirmed everything the prosecution had alleged, that he viewed elderly people as disposable resources, whose only value lay in what he could steal from them. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: 11 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, and attempted murder in my case. The judge sentenced Jake to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his crimes represented a particularly heinous betrayal of trust and vulnerability. But for me, the real victory wasn't in seeing Jake punished. It was in knowing that his killing spree had finally ended, that no other elderly person would fall victim to his predatory charm. During the sentencing phase, I was allowed to make a victim impact statement. I stood at that podium, looking directly at Jake Morrison for what I hoped would be the last time, and spoke for all the women who would never have the chance to speak for themselves. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and strong. This man thought he could prey on elderly people because he believed we were helpless, forgotten, too confused to fight back. He was wrong. We are mothers, daughters, grandmothers who've survived wars, depressions, and losses that would break weaker people. We've built families, run businesses, and kept communities together through the hardest times imaginable. I looked directly at Jake as I continued. You saw our age as weakness, our loneliness as vulnerability, our trust as stupidity. But what you failed to understand is that survival makes us strong, not weak. And sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. Jake was led away in shackles, and I never saw him again. But his trial had exposed a network of elder abuse that extended far beyond his individual crimes. The investigation led to new laws requiring background checks for in-home caregivers, better monitoring of elderly people living alone, and increased resources for investigating suspicious deaths among the elderly population. The farm that Jake had planned to inherit became the foundation for the Eleanor Vaughn Center for Elder Safety. Named for his first known victim, the center provides resources for elderly people to verify the backgrounds of potential caregivers, offers support for those who've been victimized by financial predators, and trains law enforcement officers to recognize the signs of systematic elder abuse. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message we sent to other predators who might be targeting vulnerable elderly people. We're not as helpless as you think, and we have allies who will listen when we speak up about abuse. 5 years have passed since I stood in that courtroom and watched Jake Morrison receive his life sentence. I'm 78 years old now, and the farm is still running strong, though I've hired legitimate help to manage the heavier work. The corn yields have been excellent. The soybeans are thriving, and I've never been prouder of the legacy Frank and I built together on this land. But more important than the agricultural success is the other kind of harvest I've been cultivating. A network of protection and support for elderly people who might otherwise fall victim to predators like Jake Morrison. The Eleanor Vaughn Center has become a model for elder protection programs across the country. We've helped identify and prosecute 12 other cases of systematic elder abuse, saved an estimated 47 elderly people from financial exploitation, and provided support services for hundreds of seniors who've been targeted by scammers and predators. Every month, I speak at senior centers and community groups about recognizing the warning signs of elder abuse. I tell them about Jake Morrison's methods, about how predators use kindness and helpfulness as weapons, about the importance of maintaining independence even when accepting assistance. The thing about predators, I always tell my audiences, is that they count on us feeling ashamed or isolated. They want us to believe we're too old, too confused, or too grateful to question their motives. But every person in this room has survived challenges that would break someone half our age. That strength doesn't disappear just because our hair turns gray. The response is always powerful. After every presentation, elderly people come up to me with their own stories. Some of narrow escapes from similar predators, others of suspicious caregivers or family members who seemed more interested in their assets than their well-being. Each conversation reinforces what I learned during those terrifying months with Jake. Elder abuse is far more common than most people realize, and it often wears the mask of helpfulness and concern. I've also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for investigating suspicious deaths among elderly people. Jake's case showed how easily systematic murder could be disguised as natural causes when the victims were elderly and the killer was patient and methodical. The farm itself has become a symbol of resilience in our community. Visitors often comment on how well-maintained everything looks, how productive the fields are, how clearly this is a place where someone takes pride in their work. What they don't always realize is that this success represents more than just agricultural skill. It represents the victory of an elderly woman who refused to be victimized by someone who thought her age made her weak. I still live in the same farmhouse where Jake Morrison planned my death, but I've made some changes to ensure my safety. Modern security systems, regular check-ins with neighbors and friends, and most importantly, a network of people who understand that isolation is often the first step toward victimization. But the most important change isn't in my security arrangements, it's in how I see myself and how the community sees elderly people in general. We're not just potential victims waiting to be preyed upon, we're survivors, fighters, people with decades of experience in overcoming challenges and protecting what matters to us. Sometimes young people ask me if I'm afraid, living alone on a remote farm after what happened with Jake. I tell them that fear is different from caution, and that being 78 years old doesn't mean being helpless. I've learned to trust my instincts, to ask questions when something doesn't feel right, and to remember that asking for help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. I also tell them about the unexpected strength I discovered during those months, when I thought I was fighting for my life. The desperate 75-year-old woman who hired Jake Morrison learned that she was capable of investigation, strategic planning, and courage she never knew she possessed. That knowledge has made every day since feel like a gift, an opportunity to use the strength I discovered for purposes that matter. The corn is almost ready for harvest again this year, and I find myself thinking about cycles, the way crops grow and are harvested, the way challenges come and are overcome, the way evil sometimes emerges but is ultimately defeated by people who refuse to be victims. Jake Morrison is spending the rest of his life in prison, where he'll never again be able to charm his way into an elderly person's trust. But more importantly, his exposure has made it harder for other predators to use the same methods, has given potential victims the knowledge they need to protect themselves. Every morning when I walk through my fields and see the healthy crops growing where Jake once planned my death, I'm reminded that the best revenge against evil is a life well lived, a purpose well served, and a legacy that protects others from the darkness you've survived. The elderly people who hear my story now understand that they don't have to be victims, that their age and experience can be sources of strength rather than vulnerability. And predators like Jake Morrison are learning that the generation they thought would be easy prey is actually made up of people who've survived the Great Depression, world wars, and countless personal challenges. We're tougher than we look, smarter than they assume, and far more dangerous when threatened than anyone expects. Jake Morrison learned that lesson too late to save himself, but maybe his failure will serve as a warning to others who think elderly people are easy targets. My name is Betty Caldwell. I'm 78 years old, and I'm still here, still fighting, still proving that sometimes the most dangerous person on any farm is the one who looks like a harmless old woman, but has the heart of a warrior. If you're listening to this story and you're facing something that seems impossible, remember what a stubborn farm widow learned when a killer came to her door disguised as help. You're stronger than your circumstances, braver than your fears, and more capable than anyone, including yourself, might realize. And sometimes when predators think they've found the perfect victim, that's exactly when ordinary people find extraordinary courage and change the world in ways that echo through generations. The monsters of this world are counting on you to stay silent, to stay grateful, to believe you're powerless. Prove them wrong.